as we continue in our study of things that were happening in the Western Church, the previous lecture I gave more attention to some of the political and organizational changes that were occurring in the Western part of the church. I would like to speak in this lecture very briefly about some of the theological developments that were occurring in the Western Church during this period of, say, 400 to 800. And I think if we wanted to understand really some of the most significant things that were occurring theologically in the Western part of the Imperial Church during this time, we could really do no better than looking at the life of Augustine of Hippo. And I had you to read that chapter on Augustine of Hippo. So you have some background about his life, some of the things that he did, things that happened to him, his writings, his theology and such. You've had a chance to look at that. So I want to pull forward about out of that information some of the things that were occurring and look at some of the major changes introduced by Augustine. And I think really one of the major things that surrounded with Augustine that he was bringing about into Western theology of that time centers around his understanding of sin, free will, salvation, election, predestination, those things that center around those concepts as they all interlink. The church had traditionally taught that sin was a free-willed personal decision as opposed to something that was an inherited sinful condition which destroyed one's free will not to sin. And so this was where the sort of the traditional teaching of the church was at that time. Well, Augustine, it appears at first, is following along this same idea of a free will, especially when he was debating the Manichaeans. This was a group to which, as you know, he had formerly been a part of prior to his conversion to Christianity. But it appears that in some of Augustine's later writings that he backs away from this free will and adopts the position of original sin, as he understood it, in which humans were powerless against the hold of sin upon their life. And so Augustine, as he begins this thinking, then believed that the initiative for conversion lies not within the human being, but within the divine, that really the human being could do nothing to initiate or begin their process of salvation, that it was all dependent upon the divine grace being given to us, and that this grace that God gives to us is a grace which we will accept because it is irresistible. God makes us, in a sense, accept His grace. And this is a gift that is given to us by God, and it's given to all those who are of the elect or the predestined, which would mean that some are predestined for salvation and some are not. And so this was the way that Augustine was beginning to develop those related concepts that we talked about of free will, original sin, election, predestination, grace, all of that. Where Augustine really begins his process is through an argument that he has with another Christian teacher of the time, Pelagius. And Pelagius said that each one of us come into the world with complete freedom to sin or not to sin. We have that free will. And that there is really no such thing as inherited sin, as original sin was sort of being understood by Augustine. Children, he would say then, have no sin until they, out of their own free will, decide to sin. So you can see that there's a good bit of variation between these two people. And of course, soon this widened into sort of a church debate that occurred in the western part of the church. And so you would have some people that would sort of soften Augustinian ideas, and some that would soften sort of Pelagius ideas. Sometimes they're called semi-Augustinians, semi-Pelagians, and they tried to find a more common meeting ground between these two different theological expressions. But clearly, with Augustine, there was a new sort of theological direction or development that was occurring in the Western Church. And it would have a significant impact. Augustine really, while he's the most probably significant theologian of this era that we're looking at, we might say that he is perhaps one of the most significant theologians of the Western Church, which includes the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And of course, his influence into Protestantism comes through Calvin particularly, and also through Luther as well. And so Augustine's a very influential person in the Western Church. And his ideas, while having a good bit of impact on the Western Church, do not have near as much impact, if any impact really significantly, in the Eastern Church, as we'll talk about in a few moments. So what we have here then with the Western Church is not only having sort of this political and organizational difference from the Eastern Church, it's now starting to have some theological differences as well. So with the adoption of Augustinian theology by large portions of the Western Church, we now have this theological difference with the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church really saw salvation as more of a transformative process whose aim is union with God and becoming in the likeness of God. They would talk about we're in the image and likeness of God. We're in the image of God by birth, and we become more in the likeness of God by our decision to walk and follow the teachings of Jesus and practice the teachings of Jesus, so that we become to look more like God, or maybe more like Christ, and we grow closer in our union with God in that process. And of course, that process is achieved by cooperation between human activity on one hand and God's grace on the other hand. It's sometimes called synergy, but it's basically the idea of cooperation between human activity and God's grace. And of course, that's a little different from Augustine, who would see all of this being dependent upon God's grace entirely, because our human will is so corrupted by the original sin that we cannot even cooperate with God in any way. And he talks talks more about it not necessarily being a transformative process, as it is more, I think, more of a transactional process, whereby God's grace is irresistibly placed within us. And so it's a more of a transactional process as opposed to a transformational process in that way. As a result of all of this, the Eastern Church would see its primary teachers to be the practitioners of holy living, people that were practicing, following the teachings of Christ, who were growing in their union with God, who were looking more Christ-like in their behavior. And so they would turn to the Christian mystics who were attempting to follow Christ as their teachers. They would turn to the great saints of the church who had modeled Christian living. And so the teachers in the Eastern Church were more practitioners of holy living. Whereas in the Western Church, after Augustine, it would see its teachers to be more of the rational philosophers like Augustine. Augustine was a brilliant thinker. He was more of a philosopher, and he had studied many of the predominant philosophies of the day, and studied even different religions of the day. And so the teachers in the Western part of the church were not so much practitioners now as they were more rationalistic philosophers like Augustine. And so this begins to mark some significant differences between the theology in the Western church and the theology in the Eastern church. And those differences are still rather pronounced along the same lines today. So when we look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, it looks more like what I just described the Eastern Church was looking like in that day. Well, what influenced Augustine? You read the chapter on him. What influences Augustine to take this approach that he does? It's hard to say for sure. We never can entirely enter into a person's mind. We have to sort of be dependent upon their writings or people that knew them. But it looks like when we look at Augustine, some of the things that might have influenced him was his own personal struggle with sin, which at times he felt powerless to control. If you read Augustine's Confessions, which is a very important work of Augustine, you will see what we're talking about, sort of this struggle that he had with sin in the times that he felt powerless to control sin, especially sexual sins, we might say, that he felt powerless to control. In addition, as you know, for a while, he studied deeply Manichaean thought. And Manichaean thought was a very dualistic way of thinking in which anything that was material was evil. And it understood Adam and Eve to be sort of passing on this sinful material world through the act of copulation. So in some sense, I think some of that Manichaean thought probably still held hold in Augustine's thinking even after he became a Christian. And then also we have to remember that Augustine was living at the time in which all of a sudden that whole western part of the Roman Empire was falling apart, and he was just starting to see all of this social chaos erupting. And of course, one of his major works, The City of God, deals with how does the Christian live now that the Roman Empire, which they had put so much trust in and connected the church with, was falling apart. And so I think with his own personal struggle with sin, sort of this negative Manichaean view towards the material and copulation and anything that is material, sort of the negative view towards society and what was happening. I think Augustine had a lot of negative thinking that was coming into his life, personally, socially, and intellectually. And I think a lot of that is seen in his theology. His theology has a rather negative, pessimistic note about it. That sort of pessimistic note in his theology, I think, is connected with some of these negative things that were occurring in his life. And that's true for all of us. All of our theology is affected by our life experience to some degree. And I think that Augustine's life experience shaped his theology, and a lot of other people evidently in the West were experiencing some of those same things, and so that his theology was much more appealing in the West, I think, felt more real to people because they were experiencing a lot of negative things. Whereas in the Eastern Church was not necessarily experiencing quite the same negative things happening there as we've talked about, and his theology was not as appealing to them. They were the theology of the saints, the mystics, and holy living. This was more appealing to them, and so they gravitated more in that direction and did not really accept and adopt some of the things that Augustine was talking about. Nonetheless, if you are a part of the Western Church tradition, that is Catholic, or if you're a Protestant, your thinking probably has been influenced to some degree or another by Augustine's thinking. But I did want you to understand that Augustine's thought, while very prominent in the West, we can't say that it was universally accepted. In fact, the eastern part of the church never did accept his teaching to the same extent. So, one of the things that I would like for you to write your conversation paper about this week is write that one-page conversation paper. In what ways has, let's put it this way, what do you see to be the positive and the negative aspects of Augustine's teaching about free will, predestination, original sin, irresistible grace, all of those concepts? What do you see to be the positive and the negative aspects of that teaching? And I imagine you're going to probably be able to find some things that were positive that you liked about Augustine, but you may have some real reservations about some of the things that Augustine was teaching as well. And so think about that. Write me about a one-page paper there of sort of your own personal viewpoint there. You'll probably want to maybe look at some of the handout materials that I sent you, but you also may want to go back and do a little bit of that reading on the chapter on Augustine, especially where these ideas are discussed in that chapter by Gonzalez. Think about them and come to your own conclusions about what's positive and negative, and write that paper for me, one page there, and get it to me by Friday if you can, because I'd like to have them by Friday so that I can look over them and continue to do your studies. Next week we'll be looking at the Celtic Church, which is one of my favorite group of Christians to look at, starting with Patrick, St. Patrick. So I look forward to having that time with you next week.